Today's video is an outright warning because the mediocre often tries to hide in the majority. And if you're someone who's said to yourself in the past, you are committed to not being mediocre, then it's even more important for you to ensure that you don't allow yourself to be found, first and foremost, hiding, but secondarily, inside of the majority. Now, it's interesting because whatever you do in life, whether it's something exceptional or whether it's something common, let's use the word mediocre, you are going to be judged externally. But that's not really what's like the big factor. The big factor is the fact that every single day we actually judge ourselves internally. And it's our internal judgments that actually determine what we go on to do. Because if you judge yourself internally as, for example, a loser or someone who doesn't know how to win, then you're not going to approach the next thing in your life as though you can win. You're not going to approach the next thing in your life as though you have an opportunity to win. And you're not even going to approach the next thing in your life as if you need to know the rules to win. So the rules will become oblivious to you. The opportunity will become an obstacle to you. And ultimately, there'll be no win for you. And that's not because there's no win available. It's actually just because of the internal judgment. So internal judgment is very important. Now, one of the things that has been occurring in, I would say, the modern day culture for quite a while is that internal judgments have become formed or highly molded by external judgments. And what's interesting about that is the world has always been like that to some degree. The world has always had the internal determined by the external. But, well, first and foremost, I think the important thing to start with is the Bible teaches us not to live like that. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, as one simple there you go, example, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it says to us that do not be conformed, that means don't be molded or don't be turned into, by the way of the world. Okay, do not be conformed to the way of the world, but be ye transformed. So become something, I might even go as far as to say in the world, right? Be ye transformed, so be turned into something in the world, become something in the world. And it says by the renewing of your mind. And it's interesting because some of the books that I've read on in the last year have asked this interesting question. And it's the question of why atheists struggle to determine and deem whether the mind is something biological and thus physical, or whether there is more to life than physiology. Is there a spiritual element to the world, right? And if there is a spiritual element to the world, and the mind is part of that spiritual element, or if there is a soulish element to the world, and the mind is part of that soulish element of the world, and if we are people that believe that the mind is something separate to the brain, because the brain is just some physiological matter, right? Which obviously does an amazing feat of genius. But if the mind is separate to the brain, or if the mind is something different to the brain, then we start a journey which is very important to understand. And that journey is, according to Romans chapter 12, verse 2, let's hinge it on this verse. According to Romans 12, verse 2, that journey is to not allow what comes into the mind to determine the mind, but rather to allow the transformation within the mind to alter the outside of our mind, i.e. our bodies, right? Our lives, our what we are actually being conformed into, or more so conformed by. And it's interesting because I love the way that the Bible doesn't even say, don't be conformed by this, but be conformed by this. It says, don't be conformed by the way of the world, but be transformed, i.e. the whole process is different when you live from what I'm going to call the inside out for the sake of the simplicity in this conversation. So I wanted to bring this up because one of the things that I'm seeing more and more often, which I know I have to combat, and not just combat because I'm a father to 6 children, and not just have to combat because I'm a husband to my amazing wife, but also have to combat because I'm a human being and I have to navigate myself in this world through means of this same conceptual idea as well, and so do you. And that's watching a world where voices on the outside are determining consciousness on the inside. Watching a world where messages on the outside are determining people's meanings on the inside. And I think it's really interesting to have this discussion, especially if you're someone like me who believes that mediocrity finds a place to hide in the majority. Because what happens a lot of the time is, if you are convinced, converted, and as a result conformed by the words of masses, then you're subject to having to become mediocre, because the masses, by virtue of the fact that they're masses, they're the majority, there's a lot of people believing those narratives, have numbers, they have big numbers. And being in an environment with big numbers, it does not mean you can't rise to the top, but being in an environment with big numbers, there's a lot of the time a desire to want to be part of the pack. And being part of the pack is staying in the world of the majority, but it's also staying, rubbing shoulders to some degree with mediocrity. And that's where the challenge is. And that's why in our current society, it's important more than ever not to necessarily become individualistic. That's not what this is about. But more so, this is about understanding that you are created, according to the Bible, fearfully and wonderfully. This is about understanding that you are a unique individual made by the divine hand of God, and therefore the capacity, the potential, more important, the purpose within you is not mediocre. And thus, you shouldn't be conformed from the voice of the masses. Like, you should be conformed, in my mind, if by anything, to the voice of the master, right? And I believe that's God himself, like your creator, my creator, our creator, because he's the one who created us. He's the one who has a clear understanding of what our potential is, what we can achieve, how we can get there, the fastest way to get there, the strongest way to get there, the best way to get there, and also all of the hurdles that we may face on the journey, all right? And that, as I'm saying that, I'm just reminded of Joseph in the Bible and his story of having a dream, and being thrown in a pit by his team, which was literally his brothers at the time, and then being sold into slavery, only to later on, through means of, again, a bunch of hurdles that he faced, be the guy in the palace and literally be in charge of everything. So that's, an interesting story that comes to mind as I'm thinking about this. So if we want to make sure that we're not plagued with mediocrity, and we're not plagued with mediocrity as a byproduct of the fact that we're attempting to hide in the majority, then the question is, well, what do we do about that? And that's a phenomenal question, because that's the kind of question that breeds the kind of thinking / the kind of answer that's literally going to make sure that you don't end up mediocre in the majority. So let's talk about it, okay? Now, a very simple thing to say could be, just do things most people don't do, right? And that effectively is the anti-majority methodology in order to become a master, right? So if you see what everyone is doing who's poor, and you just tell yourself you're going to do the opposite, that's great, because that must be the formula for being rich, right? Due to scientifically the law of polarity, that should work. However, the reality is, the same way there was this Apple fad, there's an app for that, right? I believe that concept of there's an app for that comes from the actual heart concept of there's a strategy for that, or there's a way for that, or there's a principle for that, or there's a path for that. And being someone who's been reading in the Bible, specifically the book of Proverbs, for somewhat like, I believe it's nearly close to 18 years now, on a daily basis, one of the things I find to be close to astounding, I think astounding is maybe even too small of a word, is the fact that the paths are laid out in the Proverbs. Like, and that makes sense, because a proverb is effectively a principle. It's a path. That's the heart essence, definition, and meaning of the word. And to think that reading through the book of Proverbs again and again and again and again can lay out to you, can reveal to you, can give you paths to practice in order for you to prosper is phenomenal. Like, it's phenomenal. Like, it's phenomenal, but it makes sense, because many authors today write books, as you can see, the many books behind me. Like, many authors today write books in order to provide principles. They write books in order to provide paths. They write books in order to ultimately provide prosperity for you and I to be able to receive because of the information that they achieved in order to share with us and distill to us in the form of a book. But so it makes sense that it would be like that. But at the same time, when you see how rich it is, that a book that was written literally over 2,000 years ago has the paths, and then more importantly, if I take a leaf out of my journey, I'm someone who made a commitment in 2004, 2005 to develop myself personally at whatever the cost may be. And on that journey, so much has happened. But just to give you an example, one of the things that have happened which really connects with this discussion is the fact that multiple times I have invested in courses, training, seminars, webinars, whatever it may be, events, and I've heard the practices being promoted. I've heard the paths being shared. I've heard the ideas being distributed. And I've often said to myself and found that's in the Bible. Like, there's a verse in the Bible that says that. And obviously there's times where people have their own spin on it. Most of the time people are saying it kind of quote unquote in their own words. Very few times in the last 2 decades have I seen people literally, as the Bible says, give honor where honor's due, or as the world currently says, give credit where credit is due. Like, very rarely do I see people say, oh, in the Bible it says this, or I found this in the Bible. And I just think some of that is due to what I would call ignorance, in the sense that these individuals aren't even aware. In many cases, I assume probably in some cases they are aware, they just don't want to share. But in many cases, these individuals are not even aware that the Bible actually says that. Okay, so for example, just a quick leaf out of the book, right? We have all heard that concept, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But that concept comes from the Bible, okay? In Matthew, I believe it's chapter 25, Jesus tells a story of a master who leaves and gives his free servants revenue. He gives each of them a certain amount of talents. He gives one 5 talents, he gives another 2 talents, and he gives another 1 talent. And when he comes back, the Bible says, has a reckoning, which basically means he does his accounting with his servants. And the first servant, who had 5, he says, I've turned the 5 into 10. And the master says, good done, good done. The master says, well done, good and faithful servant. Like, you've been ruler with 5, and you've turned your 5 into 10. Like, now I'm going to give you basically 5 kingdoms, effectively, to rule over, right? And one of the things I love sharing with people is that these individuals worked with a master and they started as a servant. But in this case of this particular individual who had 5, turned the 5 to 10, and then was made ruler over 5 lands, if you think of it like that, he started off as a servant, but he ended up in the story anyway as a ruler. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people in our modern culture, especially because there's so much of this social media, microwave kind of mindset, that people don't realize that Jesus said this, like, if you are willing to serve, you open the gates to become a ruler. You open the gates to be able to rule. And this is what Jesus, in a nutshell, in a way, was saying in this story. He said, you had 5, you now have 10, go and become the ruler over these 5 lands. And if you're a ruler, that if you go to rule over 5 lands, that makes you a ruler. So he became a ruler, even though he started off as a servant. And then the second servant, again, he had 2. He turned his 2 into 4. And then again, the master says the same thing to him, like, well done, good and faithful servant. You've turned your 2 into 4. Go and rule over these 2 lands. And then obviously the last servant, he says to him, you know, where's the talent that you had? And he said, well, I hid the talent. And there's a whole story in just his response, which I get extremely zealous and passionate about teaching when I get the opportunity. But he says to him, he says, you wicked and slothful servant. And he says, take from him that which he has and give it, this 1 talent that he hid, and give it to the one who turned the 5 to 10. And then Jesus says, for everyone who has shall be given more, even in abundance. And to everyone who does not have, what he has shall be taken away from him. And that, in a nutshell, is what today we say the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Like, today we use that slogan as though it wasn't originated from the Bible, when over 2,000 years ago that was spoken as a conclusion to a parable. So the same way that we live in a world where we hear these slogans, we hear these mantras, and sometimes we just think, wow, like this individual who said that is so smart, or this individual who said that is so cool. I think sometimes it will do us value, it will do us justice to dig a bit deeper and just to literally check in, like, where does this come from? Where does this idea actually come from? And most of the time I found you can't necessarily do that by asking the person who said the snazzy slogan. Like, a lot of the time, people are going to tell you, oh, I heard it from someone else, or I made it up myself, or I recognized it through living this life, or etc. And that's cool. Like, however they believe they found it is cool to them. What's interesting to me is because I was someone who was reading the Bible from the age of 19, I was able to see the Bible whilst people were speaking, even though those people may not have attested what they were saying to the Bible. So this is really important as we think about how to make sure that we're not, I guess, washed away with the majority because we're operating in mediocrity. Because that is part of mediocrity. A form of mediocrity is not knowing where to get your source information from. Like, if you get your source information from mainstream media, then again, you are lining yourself up to be mediocre, and thus you're lining yourself up to be in the majority. Because when you recognize within yourself that you're operating in a level of mediocrity, what most people do is they hide. Like, they hide. And where's the best place to hide? It's not going to be with the optimizers of society. It's not going to be with the highest performers of society. It's not going to be with those who are operating at their next level. Like, people who are operating in mediocrity, when they have the moments of reflection that we all have, when they realize to themselves, I could be doing better, I could be operating better, I could be doing more, I could be helping more, I could be having a greater impact. When they realize that, they hide. They genuinely hide, and they often tend to hide in places where there is a majority. But what most people who are operating in mediocrity and then become subject to the majority don't realize is every moment spent in the echelons of the majority is conforming that individual to operate with more mediocrity. And this is the reason why I think I can say confidently, mediocrity is not an accident. Mediocrity is not an accident. And as I say that, I'm thinking of the countless times people have said to me, oh, but Samuel, do you think everyone should be an entrepreneur? Now, I know entrepreneurship is slightly different in terms of the topic that we're talking about, but it's something that happens all the time. Like, when I speak about entrepreneurship and the power of entrepreneurship, when I speak about, business ownership, and I coach business owners and leaders, like, very often, especially when I'm speaking in a forum where, let's say, someone in the audience or someone in that conversation is not necessarily a business owner, the instinctive, a lot of the time, not all the time, but the instinctive response is to protect themselves. And in protecting themselves, again, many human beings do this. So this is not subject to people who are currently working as an employee. But many human beings, when they feel in any way, shape or form threatened, when they feel in any way, shape or form having to give an account for their current situation and their current decisions, if they are not operating in humility, they will reach for protection and they will attempt to protect themselves. And again, that form of protection, subconsciously and psychologically, a lot of the time comes in different shapes and forms. One of them is through means of disrespect and disregard. In linguistics, it's called an ad hominem fallacy, where people use a idea of discreditation to remove the focus of the real conversation. So I might say in a forum, entrepreneurship is the key to true growth and stability in a culture and society. And someone else who, for example, wants a job, who wants to protect himself, may say, oh, but 75% of businesses fail in the first 5 years. So as a result, entrepreneurship doesn't work, for example, right? And what they're doing is they're moving the buck from having to answer the question for themselves as to, are they living below their potential? Are they failing to contribute to the scale of society because they're deciding to work a job over entrepreneurship? Now, again, this is not my this is not my preaching on everyone should be an entrepreneur. That's not what this is about. What this is about is understanding that using an ad hom using an ad hoc using an ad hon you know what it is, right? Using an ad hominem fallacy. Let me see how it's said properly so I can make sure I'm saying it properly. There we go. No. There we go. Using an ad hominem fallacy. There we go. We got it there. Or an ad hominem legacy argument, as it comes up here. All right. But using such doesn't it doesn't protect you. Okay. It doesn't protect you because going back to where we started in this conversation today, there's internal judgment and there's external judgment. And to use an ad hominem fallacy to protect yourself is really just deferring the conversation of the mediocrity and of hiding in the majority. So let's get down to business, right? If mediocrity often endeavors to hide in the majority, and you've made a commitment and a decision within yourself that you will no longer be operating in mediocrity, thus you don't have a place to hide in the corridors of the majority. So if you understand that as a foundational premise, the question then becomes, well, Samuel, how do I break out of the majority? Because I don't want my positioning in the majority to continually conform me into being someone operating in mediocrity. And the answer to that is simple. The answer to that is choose a specific area in your life. And the reason I use the word choose is because there may be many areas in your life that you can decide to do this on and go all in. And by go all in, I don't mean attempt to become, the world's greatest in this field. That's not what I'm talking about. Because by virtue of doing this process I'm talking about, you will become the world's greatest at being yourself. And that's effectively the outcome we desire. That's the key to all of this. But choose an area in your life. For example, the big three areas many people talk about: health, wealth, relationships. Okay? And if we take an area like health and we take an angle of that like fitness, and you say to yourself, you've always wanted to get fit, but you've always allowed yourself to operate in mediocrity, and you, like, I know, like that in order to get to that level of dialogue with oneself, like, we just have to be brutally honest and blatantly transparent. But if we can get to that brutal honesty and we can get to that blatant transparency, then it becomes simple for us to say to ourselves, okay, look, I've been mediocre in my endeavors of fitness and health, and I don't want to be mediocre anymore. I want to be optimal. I want to improve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose that area, if that's the area, if it's not an area in relationships, if it's not an area in wealth, and I'm going to go all in. And going all in is not about doing what anyone else would do. Again, we're veering away from the path of mediocrity. We're veering away from the path of the majority. Going all in is doing what other people are not willing to do. And more importantly, maybe this should be a better measure for you, what you have not previously been willing to do in order for you to get through in that area. So I'll give you a perfect, simple example. I mentioned health, so I'll use that as an example. 2016, I replaced my wife's income. By the grace of God, she was able to leave work. 2016 late, roughly 2017, I replaced my income. And as a result, I decided to leave the job that I was working at the time. And being a teacher, I couldn't leave straight away. I had to give like 3-4 months notice, like a term's notice. So that happened years ago, right? And since leaving conventional work, since leaving like a conventional day job, as it were, 9 to 5, there was never a time where I took my health seriously. And maybe part of that is because it was my finances that allowed me, supported me, or was the key in my mind to the freedom that I was able to create. So because my finances was the key to the freedom I was able to create, I feel like I went all in on my finances and just got more and more focused on that, building that out, developing that, becoming one with what I perceive to be greatness or excellence in that area. And in doing so, like, I guess I can say like my health was so far from a priority. Like I'd eat whatever I wanted to eat, whenever I wanted to eat. Sometimes it will result in like increased weight. Sometimes it will result in just other stuff. But it's just, it wasn't optimal. So fast forward to 2024, and I basically say to myself, like, I want to get fit. I want to get fit. Like I feel free. I feel like financially, like I don't have a burden, but I actually want to get fit. And there was two big strands that were motivating this at the time. And I share these motivations because your motivations will be essential for you to pull the trigger and go through with this. One big motivation was my children are still currently young. So in my mind, I was like, well, I want to be as healthy as possible for as long as possible to enjoy as much life as possible with them. And then side by side with that, it was, I wanted them to get into some of the things that I was interested in the realm of health and fitness. So that was one strand. The second strand was, I believed that if I started to feel better, if I got healthier, then it would have a knock-on effect on my business, and thus, again, I'd get wealthier. So maybe the wealth was, again, a motivation. I don't know. I assume it was. But those are the two strands that motivate. So what I did is I started looking for, firstly, years before I started doing like karate, I started looking for a karate dojo that I could start learning karate, and I started doing that with my oldest son. We did that for a few months, maybe like 6 to 7 months, and then we kind of dropped off, not because we didn't want to keep doing it, but because we moved home. We moved to over an hour away from the dojo that we were at, so again, that kind of crushed that at that time. Then, fast forward to the place we moved to an hour away, we looked for a karate dojo for quite a while, didn't really find anything. Then we found a kickboxing club. So I started going to the kickboxing club mainly on my own. I took two of the oldest children a couple of times, but I mainly started going on my own because in my mind it was kind of like, just get it done. But again, I was only doing that for like 2-3 months, and then I stopped. So 2024, fast forward to 2024, I've got this newfound motivation to make it happen. So I joined a Muay Thai gym, which was literally like under 7 minutes from where I lived. And I was going hard. They have 2 days a week where adults can do Muay Thai sessions, and I was going every 2 days, or I was going to the 2 classes each week, every week, for like a year straight. And I was saying to myself, as I build up this habit of going and training Muay Thai twice a week, I want to add something else on, because I have the time. At the time, I thought I had the time, so I can do this. So over time, after that year, I then started to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the good thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is it's really interesting, just the way the business dynamic works for dojos and I guess martial arts in the UK. But if you are a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym, 9 times out of 10, you're going to run classes every day, because you're not going to have another quote-unquote sport that pays the bills or keeps the lights on, or rents your space with you. Whereas if you're a Muay Thai gym, like the Muay Thai gym I was a part of, like, it's part of a boxing club, and the boxing club is kind of like the main quote-unquote sport there, and obviously being in Britain, that would make sense. So the boxing club pays the bills, and the Muay Thai club is just in there as well. So that's partly why I only had 2 sessions a week, etc. So the benefit of starting to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and one of the reasons I wanted to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is I could do more training in a week. So for about 4 months, I was training 5 days a week. And that 5 days a week was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu effectively Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I was doing beginners classes, so it'd be Monday evening, Wednesday evening, and then typically a Friday morning when I'd make it up early enough to the class. If not, I'd go on a Friday afternoon, and Muay Thai on Tuesday and Thursday. Now, physically, it was strenuous. Like, there were days where I felt so beat up, didn't want to get out of bed just because of the workout the day before. But psychologically, like, it was empowering, because you're learning a new skill, you're learning something new, right? And whilst I spent that, call it, year and 6 months doing that, 4 months in terms of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a year and a half in terms of the Muay Thai, what I started to realize is that most people aren't doing this. Most people aren't doing this. Now, what's interesting is there were the guys who were going hard in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and maybe going 5 days a week, maybe going 4 days a week, right? There were the guys who were going hard in the Muay Thai gym I was at and maybe coming twice a week, just like I was going twice a week at the period. But I was the only guy doing what I was doing, which was doing the 2 days a week in the Muay Thai and then obviously the 3 days a week at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I don't say that to say that I'm more impressive than anyone else. I don't say that to say that I'm better than anyone else. I say that to say that I had to have my own routine because I wasn't attempting to A, be mediocre, or B, stay in the majority. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about an area in your life where you can commit to going all in. And going all in the way that going all in is going to look like for you. I've just given you that example of me, and I've purposely taken it away from a cash flow idea or from a wealth perspective, just so that there can be a holistic view of what I'm talking about more so in this video. But I want you to think for yourself about an area that you can make a commitment to go all in, and I would love for you to share that in the comments below, and then I want you to go do that and grow. And don't allow yourself to operate in mediocrity and end up hiding in the majority, because as you hide in the majority, you'll only end up being further conformed to being someone who operates with mediocrity. So with that being said, Sammy, I can win. I'm signing out. I pray you got tons of value from this video. I don't know if you saw the thumbnail on yesterday's video, but it was so janky. YouTube decided to choose some thumbnail where my eye was all in some weird position. So I think we're going to have to work on getting actual thumbnails on these daily videos as well. With that being said, as I always say, remember, small keys open big doors. Good day, God bless, and I'll see you on the next one. Let's go.